Happy Monday morning, everybody. Welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that takes you on a journey through some of the most interesting countries in the world, introduces you to some interesting people, some very strange and provocative events, and gives you an overview of my experiences in countries around the world. We're getting ready to start today on a couple of episode series on Israel and Palestine. This is going to be a challenging one for me because I'm a little bit torn about the time that I spent in this region of the world. Don't get me wrong, it's an area that I love very much. Jerusalem is literally one of my favorite cities in the world. But there were things that happened there in Israel and Palestine that were very successful and that I'll remember very fondly. And there were those that I will remember for other reasons as well, and we'll get into some of that. I'm going to be very transparent about it. A lot of my experiences in Israel and Palestine are shared here in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which is available on Amazon. I was thinking back earlier this week about my first trip to Israel. It was in 1998, and I was just leaving the economic development business in the United States. I'd resigned as president and CEO of the Colorado Springs, Colorado Chamber of Commerce, and was just a couple of months away from going on our first long-term assignment to Romania, which I talked about in previous episodes. I had the opportunity during that period to go to Israel to scope out some potential business opportunities for a client who had hired me to do so. And so I made my first trip to Jerusalem. Of course, going to Jerusalem requires you first to go to Tel Aviv because that's where the international airport is. And so I flew into Tel Aviv, and I found out very quickly the first rule about travel in Israel. And that is that it's difficult to get into the country. It's even more difficult to get out of the country, but that's another story for another day. But the getting into the country on that first trip was a little bit of a debacle. It required a lot of questions, answers to questions. It required a lot of standing around waiting. And I realized at that point in time, and I never made this mistake again, that when you go to an immigration counter in Israel, whether it is at the airport or whether it's at a land crossing, don't ever go to one with a female immigration officer. Now, don't get all upset. Don't get me wrong. I'm not being sexist at all. But they tend to be tougher than the men. And they will ask a lot more questions. They're not intimidated. They will grill you pretty heavily. And if you give the wrong answer, or you don't have all the information that they require, you will sit in a room and they will keep asking you questions until they get done asking you questions. And you don't know how long that's going to be. Well, I found that out on my first trip. And the second thing I found out on that first trip about travel in Israel is that you can never really depend on what's going on any particular day. So I landed on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so once I finally got out of the airport, and into a taxi headed to Jerusalem. My driver couldn't get me to the hotel because the Feast of Tabernacles celebration had everything blocked. So I ended up in a strange city at that time, having to walk blocks with pulling my luggage to find at that time it was a guest house, not a hotel, that I was staying at. That was a debacle in itself. I was a sweaty mess by the time that I got there. But I got settled in and did the work in Jerusalem that I needed to do. Traveled outside of Jerusalem to many industrial sites and many of the settlements, including one called Gush Etzion, where a young lady gave me this beautiful scented quilted pillow that says Gush Etzion on it. Well, Gush Etzion does not exist anymore because it was a settlement that was emptied and destroyed just a few years ago, actually, and the settlers relocated. So I traveled through a lot of the settlements and then went into Gaza. And that was my first, but not my last trip into Gaza. And it is a story on its own. Of course, Gaza is ruled by Hamas, and they are continually at conflict with Israel. Just recently, of course, there was a major conflict between the two that resulted in a great deal of loss of life and a very visible debate about the Palestinian question around the world. But when I was in Gaza in the late 1990s, it was just a sad place. It was very backward, taciturn. It was obvious that Hamas was not focused on any kind of economic growth. It was very much cordoned off, as it still is. The access to Gaza is regulated by the Israelis, and it was a hapless, hopeless place. I never felt in danger there, any of my trips to Gaza, but I just felt this feeling of hopelessness that was hard to overcome. That first trip taught me a little bit about the psyche of the Israelis and the Palestinians. I remember going to a speech in Gush Etzion, this settlement, that was made by a settler, one of the leaders of the community, and he vociferously punctuated the Israelis' right to put settlements anywhere in Israel that they chose to do so. A few days later, I was in Hebron, and I had the chance to interact both with the Israelis there, which have a small area of the city, and also the Palestinians, which have a much larger area in Hebron. And the Palestinians were decrying the illegality of the Israelis' claim to what had been their land, and decrying the increasing number of settlements that were being built on what they considered to be their land. I listened to both arguments very intently. And I will tell you that both of them at some level made sense. And both of them at some level didn't make sense. And that in itself is the reality of Israel and Palestine. Is that both sides have an element of being right, and both sides have an element of being wrong. And if you take any particular side, what you miss is all the gray area in between, because it's not a black and white situation. We'd like to think it is, and some of my Christian listeners are going to vociferously say that it's a black and white issue. Israel was given to, biblically, to the Jews. It belongs to them. Therefore, they should be able to settle it anywhere they want. I wish it were that easy. But it's not. It's simply not. And I found that out during my first trip. We were traveling through Bethlehem during that trip, and a skirmish broke out between some Palestinian youths and IDF soldiers. IDF is Israeli Defense Force soldiers. And rocks were thrown, and we happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and rocks were bouncing off of our car. I was laying down in the back seat, and the car took quite a big shellacking. I didn't, fortunately, but the car did. I joked with Debbie when I got home that I was going to change the Christmas carol, the words of the Christmas carol, to "Come to Bethlehem and see Palestinians throwing rocks at me." And we laughed quite a bit about that, but it happened. And if you are in Israel and Palestine enough, it's bound to happen at some point. You'll be in that situation, no doubt, or worse, actually. So that was my introduction in 1998. Years later, I returned to Israel to do an extensive amount of work on something called the West Bank Trade Project. That was trying to facilitate trade between the Israeli and Palestinian communities, not just to increase incomes, but also to bring some harmony and dialogue and discussion between the two groups. And I'll talk more about that project as we go. But I was living in Jordan at the time, running a U.S. government-funded project there. And I was asked to go and, first of all, scope this particular project, and then later on to go and do some short-term work on it before coming back later on as acting chief of party for the project. But my first trip over from Jordan was across the King Hussein Bridge, which is on the Jordanian side, and the Allenby Bridge, which is on the Israeli side. So you go to the King Hussein side, you get all your paperwork in order. They put you on a bus or a van. They drive you to the Allenby side, where you go through the Israeli immigration. And I had some funny experiences at that bridge. I crossed that bridge many times to go from Jordan to Israel, and you never, ever knew what to expect. And this is another thing I learned about traveling in Israel, is randomness is their pattern. Hear me out on this. Every time you go to a checkpoint, in this case it was the Allenby Bridge, but it also happened at the Kalindia checkpoint many times, going from Ramallah to Jerusalem, where I crossed dozens and dozens and dozens of times. You never knew what to expect. One day, it would be very easy. You'd go right through, there'd be few questions. They would move you through the system, you'd be on your way. The next day, it might take hours because there were all kinds of questions and waiting and dialogue. The next day, you might not get to cross at all. They might send you to another checkpoint. Another day, again, it might be easy to cross. You didn't know. And a lot of expats especially would complain about, oh, they don't know what they're doing. Why can't they get it right? They got it right every time. That's what they didn't understand. The Israelis knew exactly what they were doing. Randomness is their pattern. By taking this approach where you never knew what to expect, they always had the position of control. You weren't in control of your schedule because you may get to cross and you may not. You weren't in control of the narrative. You were in control of nothing. They had total control. That's why it was very difficult to plan a dinner party or even to plan dinner with friends or your spouse when you had to cross one of those checkpoints, like when I went from Ramallah to Jerusalem. Because simply you might get to the Kalindia checkpoint and be there for 3 hours. Or you might get there and be there for 10 minutes. You just didn't know. So that randomness is how the Israeli Defense Force exerted the control that they needed to protect their borders. And because of this randomness, the longer you were there, you learned how to navigate that system. Okay? There were times when I made mistakes, but for the most part, after that first trip, I understood how to deal with the system. For instance, when I would go across the King Hussein Bridge from Jordan over to the Allenby Bridge to the Israeli side and get ready to go to the immigration counter, I would always wear sunglasses, a baseball cap, jeans, a knit shirt, or a button-down shirt, look like a tourist. And I would always be asked, why are you going to Israel? Going for tourism. Where are you staying? Jerusalem. What hotel are you at? Sometimes it was the American colony, sometimes it was the ambassador. Why are you staying in East Jerusalem? Because this is where my company booked the hotel. Do they have a problem with West Jerusalem? No, not at all. They just booked the hotel in East Jerusalem, and that's why I'm staying there. What are you going to do while you're there? See the touristic sites. Will you be going into the areas outside of Israeli control? No, I will not. All these questions, and you knew the answers. Because if you said that I'm going to Jerusalem, Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, you're done. They sit you in a room, you're going to get talked to for a long time. Because Ramallah, Nablus, and Hebron were all under Palestinian authority control. If you showed up in a suit and said you were going for business. This unleashed a whole series of questions about what business, why are you there, what company, who's your sponsor, can you call them? You're going to wait for a long time. The easiest thing was say, I'm a tourist. And then you get in and you do what you need to do. Now you might say, well, that's lying to the immigration officer. Well, they forced you to do that. Because if you didn't do that, you were going to be detained for a very long time. I'll give you an example. A colleague and I were crossing one day, and we actually had some very important business to do that day. We had a meeting with Palestinian Authority head Mahmoud Abbas, called Abu Mazen. And I told my friend, who had never crossed there before, wear a baseball cap, look like a tourist, tell him you're a tourist, don't tell him you have any meetings. We'll get across, we'll go to Jerusalem, across Kalindi into Ramallah, we'll have our meetings. No harm, no foul. But it's very intimidating when you go up to the counter, because the IDF soldiers are very well trained, and they know the questions to ask, and they know the pressure points to push. So we went up to the counter at the same time, me to one, him to another. I saw that he had a female immigration officer, and I said, this is a bad thing. So I got some light questions. I said, we're a tourist, we're going across, no problem. My friend begins to get more and more questions. Okay, what hotel are you staying at? Why are you there? What are you doing? Why are you visiting these particular sites? And I heard this going on as I was getting processed through. And I see that this is going in the wrong direction. My friend's getting frustrated, doesn't know what to say. If I intervene, then I'm going to get drug into the thing as well. So I go ahead and clear immigration. I'm standing on the other side and I'm just watching this show. And finally, the female immigration officer says, so you're just going for tourism. You have no meetings at all. Why do you have a briefcase? What's in your briefcase? And he said, well, just paperwork. But why do you have a briefcase if you're going for tourism? Well, I do have a couple meetings. And I'm thinking, oh, no. Number one, why did you bring a briefcase? Number two, why did you say that? She said, what meetings do you have? Well, we have meetings with some government officials. Oh, no, I'm thinking, this is bad. Because now she's going to ask which government officials, and he doesn't know any Israeli government officials. Sure enough, she says, what government officials? What ministry? Well, I'm not sure. You have meetings and you don't know where you're meeting or who you're meeting? I want to call who you're meeting. And he said, well, I don't have any numbers. I don't have their names. Then how do you have meetings if you don't have numbers and names? And she kept up until he finally said, my meetings aren't in Israel. They're actually with the Palestinian Authority. And right then I knew he's done. And she asked, so you are crossing into Palestine? Well, yes, just briefly to have this meeting. But for the most part, I'm a tourist. Who are you meeting with? Now I really know he's done. Because he says, with the head of the Palestinian Authority. And she knew very well who the head of the Palestinian Authority was. But she looks at him and says, and who is that? And he sighs and says, Abu Mazen. She said, go sit in that room. Somebody will come and talk to you. So he looks at me helplessly, and I just shrug because I can't help him. So he goes and sits in the room. And I had to leave and go and do our business. He never made that meeting. They sent him right back to Jordan. Sometimes, though, when you do everything right, it doesn't go the way you hope. I carried 2 passports at that time because I was working in some areas where you couldn't have an Israeli stamp in your passport. And so I was going across Allenby one day, and I realized that I have the wrong passport. I have the one that I use when I'm working in countries that are not friendly to Israel and will not let you in if you have an Israeli stamp. I also realize that if I say anything, then there's going to be a big issue. So I go up to the immigration counter, hand the passport, and I know that they have the option of stamping a paper. They've done it before. I know they have this option. So I have to stand there and determine, do I ask her to stamp the paper or do I not? If I don't, then she's definitely going to stamp the passport, and then it's useless to me in countries that are not friendly to Israel. If I do mention it, then I may be interrogated for the next 4 hours. But I finally decide I'm going to try this. And said, I was very transparent with her. I told her the truth. I said, ma'am, I work all over the world. And like a lot of people who work all over the world, I have 2 passports. And I picked up the wrong one this morning. This is the one that I use working in other areas of the world. And I would just kindly ask you if you could stamp the paper, because if you stamp the passport, then obviously that's going to be an issue for me in some other areas. I said, I appreciate the fact that you don't agree with that. I appreciate the fact that even that is offensive, that it has to be that way. And I appreciate that very much. I'm just asking kindly, knowing the reality of the situation, if you could do this for me. And I'll never forget it. She looks at me and she smiles. And then she reaches down, opens my passport, stamps the page, and hands it to me and said, "Have a nice day." An act of defiance. An act of control. I'd done everything right. I'd been honest and transparent. And yet, she did what she needed, or felt that she needed, to do. Again, this was the random nature of crossing into Israel. There were times I went across the Allenby Bridge with no issue at all, crossed in 10 minutes. There were times when it took hours and where I sat in a room and answered questions from the IDF. They were never mean. They were never intimidating. They simply held you there and asked you questions. The interesting thing, the first trip I made to Israel was quite funny because it was actually harder for me to get out than in, which sounds crazy, right? But I got interrogated on the way out and pulled aside and asked all these questions. Again, other trips that I made in, I went out with no issues whatsoever. Randomness. That is a pattern. I said many times, and I have a lot of friends who don't like to hear this, but it's absolutely the truth. I've worked in virtually every conflict zone in the world. And I can tell you that I've had more guns stuck in my face by IDF soldiers than I ever had anywhere else in the world. Because they take security very seriously. And it doesn't matter what color your passport is, you follow their rules. Let me give you a couple of examples. One day I was traveling from my office in Ramallah across Kalindia checkpoint into East Jerusalem, where I was living at the time. It was probably 5 o'clock in the evening, and I had a couple of colleagues with me who were Jordanians. They were Palestinians, but they carried Jordanian passports. We had had no issues crossing the entire week. It had been a really light week on Kalindia, and the traffic wasn't very bad, and we'd been able to cross without any issues. So this particular evening, we pull up to Kalindia, and there is a young lady, an IDF soldier. She's 18, 19 years old. And she collects our passports, as they do every time. She looks at my passport. She looks at my Jordanian colleagues' passports. And she says, "You," points at me, "you can cross. The three of you go through the walking checkpoint." And most of the time, I would have let that go. Because, again, it's the randomness of crossing from Palestine into Israel. But on this particular evening, I just decided, you know what? These Palestinian colleagues from Jordan don't deserve this. The walking checkpoint, they called it the cattle stalls because it was like walking into a slaughterhouse, a series of gates that you had to go through like you were a cow walking into a slaughterhouse. And it was across a trash dump. They were in suits, and they were going to get dusty and smelly and really have a terrible time going through that walking checkpoint. And so I decided to do something that I rarely ever did, and I didn't do ever again. I said, "I'm sorry, but this isn't right. So if you're going to force them to go through the walking checkpoint, then I'm going to go through it myself." Well, what I thought would happen is, because of my American passport, she would say, "All right, whatever, just go drive on." Instead, she looks at me and says, "Okay, fine, your choice." And so all of us went through this walking checkpoint, across the trash dump in our suits, through the muck and the smell, and walked through those cattle stalls to the other side. And on that day, I got a little bit of a glimpse of what the Palestinians go through virtually every single day of their life. The dehumanization, if you will, of people. I'm not being political here. I'm saying that on that occasion, I saw the dehumanization of people who I respected a great deal, who would never and would never have antagonized the state of Israel overtly. But because of their ethnicity, they were forced to go through this very onerous procedure. And I'm actually glad that day that I made that choice, because I got a little bit of a glimpse of what the Palestinians go through virtually every day. And here's something funny. A couple of days later, I'm going through Calindia on my own. And we pull up. A young man is there this time. I hand him my passport. He looks at it and he looks at me. He said, "Oh, you're from the States. Where?" And I said, "Well, from Cleveland, Tennessee, near Chattanooga." And he says, "Rock on, man. I'm from Chattanooga." And we had a nice conversation. He let me go right through. What you find out is that these IDF soldiers, they may be 19, 20 years old, but they have 100% power in any situation to make a decision that alters your day or your evening. They can hold you there, they can let you go, and you have very little recourse about it. Again, randomness is the pattern. I always breathed a sigh of relief when I got across Calindia, because then you were straight shot into Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Let me tell you a little bit about Jerusalem. If you've been there, you may have been there as a tourist, so you know a lot of the touristic sites. I'm not going to really dwell on that. I'm going to dwell on my perceptions of Jerusalem as a location and in the geopolitical context of the situation in the region. So when I was in Jerusalem, when I first visited there, I stayed at the American Colony Hotel. And as a matter of fact, Debbie and I took a trip there, stayed at the American Colony, which is one of the nicest hotels in East Jerusalem. And when we say East Jerusalem, we're talking about the more Palestinian area of Jerusalem, the more Muslim area of Jerusalem. West Jerusalem tends to be the more Jewish and Christian area of the city. I always felt more comfortable staying in East Jerusalem. There are many reasons for that. I'll go into it at a later date. But I felt very comfortable among our Muslim brothers in East Jerusalem. And the American Colony was a pristine hotel. It was it was a historic villa that had been occupied by one of the pashas at some point. Very Ottoman in its design. Beautiful place. And Debbie loved it. We had a great time during her visit there. But when I was working in the area, I typically stayed at the Ambassador Hotel, which was a few blocks away from the American Colony. The Ambassador was a little more old school hotel, but I liked it. It was modern enough, and I knew the staff very well, and they knew me because I'd been there for so long. Had a beautiful outdoor area where you could sit and look out over East Jerusalem. My room, there was a mosque right outside of my room, so my wake-up call every morning was the mullah or the imam saying their prayers. And it had a very good bakery in the Ambassador Hotel as well, which was a bonus for me. The man who managed the bakery made excellent cinnamon rolls. I mean, really, really good ones. And so every morning I would grab one of those cinnamon rolls, and when our driver came to pick me up, he had picked up our deputy first, Ronit, and at her home, and then came to pick me up, and I would come out with 2 cups of coffee and a cinnamon roll, and we would split it. And one morning, I'd been rushing around. It'd been one of those mornings where I had a lot of email to send and things hadn't gone exactly right. And I grabbed the 2 cups of coffee, but then I got distracted by a phone call. driver showed up with Ronit, and I ran out without the cinnamon roll, just with the cups of coffee. And I hand her the coffee. I'm still on the phone. And the driver pulls out of the parking lot, and I feel her staring at me. Finally, my call's over. I said, "What?" She's motions. "Oh, the cinnamon roll. I forgot the cinnamon roll." And I won't say exactly what she said because it wasn't very nice, but she said, "You had one job, and you couldn't even do it. Now what am I going to do? I don't have my cinnamon roll. My day's ruined." And she ran it all the way to Ramallah about that cinnamon roll. It was a very, very funny, and that was Ronit to a T. I'll talk more about Ronit later. But the East Jerusalem had this vibe about it that I really liked. It had the outdoor markets and the ethos, if you will, of the Muslim world that I was so used to because I'd worked in it for so long. And on days off, I would walk through East Jerusalem down to the Damascus Gate, which was the gate to the old city that was accessible in East Jerusalem. And it led into the Arab quarter. And I would walk through that gate and head directly to a place called the Austrian Hostel, which was near where the Via Dolorosa intersects the through street. Now, the Austrian Hostel had no sign. You had to know where it was. And Ronit and I used to go there virtually every time we had a day off. We would meet there. And you push the buzzer, door opens, and you go upstairs to the coffee shop. You get a latte and an apple strudel. That was our thing. And then after that, you go up on the roof of the Austrian Hostel. You could see out over the old city of Jerusalem, and it was fantastic. Just fantastic. And so we would spend time eating, walking around, and then I would retire back to my lodging in East Jerusalem. She would head back to West Jerusalem, and we would be immersed in our separate worlds. I remember standing on the parapet of the old city near Jaffa Gate, which is the gate where nearest David's Tower as you come into the Christian quarter. And standing up there on one of my early trips, you could see that venerable old King David Hotel in West Jerusalem. The King David is a luxury hotel. It's known for its luxurious accommodations. It's also known for a really, really good dessert bar. And my first trip there in '98 is when I got introduced to the King David Hotel, and it was a rough trip. We went into Gaza. As I said, we got rocked in Bethlehem. We'd done all these things. It wasn't easy at all. And so when I got back to Jerusalem, I told my friend Jay, "Look, I'm going to the King David. I'm checking in. I'm going to the dessert bar. Don't call me. Don't come and get me. That's where I'm going to be." And so I went over there and binged on great dessert, had a nice shower. But sure enough, Jay and his friends showed up and convinced me to go out for a night in the old city, which I'm not upset about at all, because that introduced me to the old city of Jerusalem, which I think is an amazing place. As a matter of fact, I went there so often, and I during my time in Jerusalem, that I can even navigate the old city at night. after the tourists were gone. And in fact, that's when I preferred it, either really early in the morning or late in the evening when the tourists were gone. Because the tourists just made everything more complicated. And quite frankly, most of them had no idea what they were looking at to begin with. They were being herded through there by guides like a bunch of sheep and had no earthly idea what they were even looking at. And in many cases, you would see, especially the Christian tourists, going through the Arab quarter down the Via Dolorosa, and almost looking with scorn at the population of that quarter of the city. And I always felt sad about that, because Christ, in his very essence, preached love for all people. And even though there is, I believe, only one way to heaven, and that's through Jesus Christ, I do not have enough hubris, and I do not have enough angst to look down on our Muslim brothers who were desperately trying to just eke out a living. Most of them weren't bothering anyone. They wanted the same things that we want. They want to live a good life. They want to have enough money to feed their family. They want to have joy and happiness. And that was in short supply in the Arab quarter of the Old City and in East Jerusalem and in Palestine. I know that I'm opening up a can of worms, and that's not my intent, because this is not a political podcast. I'm simply giving you my thoughts and my recollections, from my time there. I have friends on both sides of this issue. I have very good friends on the Israeli side. I have very good friends on the Palestinian side who will never agree with each other. But they've learned to respect and communicate with each other. And I think that that's the thing that was lacking during my time in Israel and Palestine more than anything else, was the ability of people to pause for just a moment and reflect on the reality of the situation and to try to understand the other side's point of view long enough to have empathy and to foster understanding. If you lived there long enough and you had enough connections, then you could never really understand the complexity of the situation, but you at least could get a window into it. But as a tourist, you'll never get that. You know what the guide tells you. And if your guide is a Christian, they're going to tell you one thing. If they're a Jew, they're going to tell you another thing. If they're Muslim, they'll tell you something else. If they're Armenian, they'll tell you something else. And you will simply navigate that old city of Jerusalem, going only where they take you, hearing only what they tell you, and believing only what you experience. And that's a real shame, because Jerusalem as itself and Israel and Palestine in a broader context is so fantastic that it requires more understanding and more context for you to ever really get to the point where you have a little bit of a window into what their world is all about. I remember not too long after I started working there, rather long term, I was in Bethlehem for some meetings. And Bethlehem is in the Palestinian Authority controlled area. Of course, Bethlehem is the traditional birthplace of Jesus. And so the Templars, the Knights Templar, built churches on virtually every holy spot. And so in Bethlehem there is the Church of the Nativity, where, as tradition goes, is built over the spot where the manger sat. And there's a big square outside of it, aptly called Manger Square. And on the other side of that square are a ring of shops. And what was very funny is that there was a Starbucks there. Across from the Church of the Nativity, you go across the square, there's a Starbucks. Except it really wasn't a Starbucks. It had the Starbucks logo, it had Starbucks cups, it had the ethos of Starbucks, but it wasn't a official Starbucks. It was totally pirated. And I asked the guy that owned it, how do you get away with this? He said, what, I'm in Palestine. What are they going to do, sue me? Good luck with that. So he totally ripped off the brand, made his own Starbucks cups, and there it was in Manger Square in Bethlehem. Things like this happen all the time that would just really remind you of the complex place that you were. I traveled to many other towns in the Palestinian Authority-controlled area. Nablus, the home of one of the best desserts you'll ever eat, kanafa. Just filled with honey and sweetness, and I can taste it right now. That sweet cheese and that honey, just amazing dessert. The home of that dessert is in Nablus. And then the town of Hebron, the burial place of Abraham and Sarah. One of the most convoluted places in the Palestinian-controlled area, because it has a conclave of Israelis surrounded by a conclave of Palestinians. The first time I went there, there was a disturbance and they were rolling tires, burning tires down the street as we were standing there shopping for trinkets. Just a strange place. Bethlehem itself was a very odd place. I had the chance to go there around Christmas time. I didn't get to go to the tree lighting. I was invited for the tree lighting in Bethlehem, which would have been the coolest thing in the whole world. But security wouldn't let me go, regrettably. And that was the first and last time I ever asked security about anything, because from then on I did what I wanted to do, and I asked for forgiveness later on. I never asked for permission again, because the one time I did, they made me miss one of the greatest experiences probably I would have in my life, and that's seeing the tree lighting in Manger Square in Bethlehem. But all these experiences, all this travel that I did, it was a cacophony of sights and smells and experiences. It was just a wonderful time, and the work we were doing was so important. I talked about Ronit earlier, who's my deputy there, and what a wonderful person. she is. Very outspoken, very tough. A former high-level official in the Israeli government, retired and went to work for us, and very well spoken. Just a quality human being. But she had that cynicism about her that most people did in that area of the world. And I'm going to close this episode of the podcast with a little story about Ronit. So as I said, on our days off, we often went to the old city and went to the Austrian hostel and had our coffee and apple strudel. And one week we had been talking a lot on our drives from Jerusalem to Ramallah about this issue of grace. She brought it up and she said, Mark, I don't really believe in this grace thing. You know, there's no grace here. You see what happens here on a daily basis. People hate each other. There's no mercy. There's no grace. There's no love. It is what it is. So, you know, I don't buy into this grace thing. And we had several conversations about it, and I wasn't convincing her at all. So a few days after that, it was our day off. We had our coffee and apple strudel at the Austrian hostel, and we were leaving, and the mosque was just letting out for morning prayers, and mullahs had whipped up a frenzy that morning, and there were a lot of angry Palestinians on the streets. And so we were standing out in front of the hostel, and an old Palestinian man with an apple cart came barreling down the street right toward this IDF soldier. He doesn't even slow down, doesn't attempt to stop. He's yelling, and he runs into the IDF soldier, knocks him down. The soldier jumps back up. Other soldiers come running, and they grab this old man, and they throw him on the ground, and they are pounding this man. They are beating him and kicking him, stomping him. And I saw a switch flip in Ronit. And first in Hebrew, then in Arabic, and finally in English, she started shouting, "Stop, stop, stop, stop right there, stop. Quit kicking him." And she ran, and she grabbed the soldier. She pulled him off. "You stop it right now. If you don't stop, then I'm going to do something about it. You don't know who I am, and you don't want to know who I am. Because I used to be a senior official in this government, and I'm telling you to stop right now." And she pulled that old man up off the ground. She got him over to the side where he could sit down on a ledge. I started picking up his apples and trying to put them back in the cart. She got some water, and she gives it to the old man. She's talking to him in Arabic. Very, very kindly. Has her arm on his shoulder and is helping him with the water. She pulled some napkins out of her purse and wiped off his face. And after a few minutes, she got up, came over to me. We walked on down the street and around the corner, and she said, I need to sit down for a minute. The adrenaline was gone, and she was shaking. And we sat down. And she said, "Mark, what just happened?" And I looked at her. I said, "Ronit, grace just happened." Said that old man caused that problem himself. He was in the wrong. I'm not saying he deserved to be beaten like that, but he deserved the punishment that he was going to get because he knew what was going to happen. And yet, you had mercy on him anyway. you had compassion for him anyway. That's what grace is. Grace is what God gave us when we didn't deserve it. When we done everything wrong. When we done the things that we knew we shouldn't do. When we caused the problem ourselves. He reached out and gave us grace. And I remember the look on her face and the tear that trickled out of her eye. And she says, okay, I get it. I'll never forget that event or that day or the look on Ronit's face. It stayed with me ever since. And in some ways, that's kind of a microcosm of working in that region. So much conflict, so much hatred, so much antagonism. And yet, this was the place where grace flowed free. This was the place where that God chose for his people. There was conflict then. There's conflict now. People ask, do you think they'll ever resolve the conflict between Israel and Palestine? I believe no. Because there's too much money in war. There's much more money in war than there is in peace. Every time that it's come close to peace, someone on either side has done something to derail the process. Because there's power in war. There's control in war. There's money in war that you'll never find in peace. So, if you ask me, will there ever be peace in that region in our lifetime? I don't believe so. And I believe the Bible reflects the same, that there'll never be peace until the Prince of Peace comes and inhabits it once and for all. We're going to stop right there today. We'll talk more about Israel and Palestine in the next episode of Some Stops Along the Way. Hope you've enjoyed this introduction, and we will see you next Monday. Have a great one.